At 5:53 p.m. on a wet Thursday in late May, a boy in a wrinkled navy graduation gown slept on the linoleum floor of the Dayton Public Library basement copy room with his cheek pressed against a sealed box of toner, one hand tucked under his jaw, the other open on the tile, as if he had set it there carefully and forgotten to take it back. He had placed his shoes side by side near the wall vent, and inside them, where insoles should have been, two cut pieces of corrugated cardboard sat upright to dry. Rainwater and chain grease had made dark streaks along both his wrists, thin tracks that disappeared under the gown sleeve and came back again at the knuckles. He did not look like he had collapsed. He looked arranged, like a person who had practiced disappearing without taking up space. The air down there held three old smells that never left: warm copier plastic, damp paper, and radiator heat that clicked in uneven little bursts even though spring had already turned. A mop bucket had been left near the stairwell with too much chlorine in the water, and the sharp chemical edge reached the copy room in waves every time the basement door opened. The fluorescent fixture above him buzzed and flickered at a rhythm the regular staff had stopped hearing years earlier. On the wall by the copy code machine, someone had taped a handwritten sign that read, "Out of order since March" in black marker, then crossed out March and written April, then crossed out April and written May. The tape had yellowed at the corners. Nothing in that room belonged to urgency. Upstairs, above the circulation desk, a digital clock stayed frozen at 3:17, red numbers glowing with the confidence of a machine that no longer told the truth and no longer got corrected. Marla Ennis, 58, circulation manager for 19 years, had filed 3 maintenance requests on that clock, and 1 on the basement fixture, and 1 on the radiator valve that hissed loud enough to wake people in the winter. She had also learned to turn off half the building in a practiced loop. Periodicals first, study hall second, children's corner last, then stairwell, then basement, then alarm. At 5:55, she rang the handbell once from behind the desk and called, "Library is closing in 5. Her voice moved through stacks and drywall and painted cinder block, flattening as it went. In the copy room, the boy did not stir. Rain tapped a thin, fast pattern on the bus shelter, plexiglass outside, harder against the metal handrail, then softened again. The same rain struck the library roof in a low, spread-out hiss that sounded almost like static, a sound that made people feel hidden without feeling safe. 2 patrons hurried out with books under jackets. One man stood under the overhang and shook his umbrella twice before stepping into the parking lot. A woman in scrubs jogged to her car with a tote bag over her head. No one looked down toward the basement windows where the concrete wells held leaves, cigarette filters, and rainwater the color of tea. The city was moving through another wet evening with the practiced indifference of people keeping schedules. At 5:59, Marla took the key ring from its hook, descended the basement stairs, and began turning off lights, one zone at a time. The long room dimmed in strips. She paused at the copy room door because she saw the gown first, a sudden block of formal blue on dirty tile, and then she saw the boy's face in profile, slack with sleep, younger than the shoulders suggested, hair flattened on one side as though he had been wearing a cap. Near his elbow sat a state-issued backpack with one zipper missing and a silver marker number stenciled on the front. She saw the cardboard insoles lined against the vent, the careful placement of them, and that detail fixed her in place for one full breath. He wasn't crying. That was the detail that would stay with her later, because even asleep he carried the same silence. People mistake for composure. She crouched slowly and touched the gown sleeve near his shoulder with 2 fingers. "Hey," she said. "You can't stay down here." He woke all at once, not with panic, but with orientation. eyes opening and moving from her hand to the doorway to the backpack in a sweep so quick it looked rehearsed. Then he sat up and checked his shoes before he checked his own face. Chain grease had dried in lines where rain had dragged it down his skin. He drew his wrist against the hem of the gown and wiped once, no expression changing. Marla started to ask if he had somewhere to go, then stopped herself because she already knew the shape of that answer from too many winter closings and too many teenagers in oversized coats charging phones by the Atlas shelf. He stood, gathered the cardboard pieces, slid them back into the shoes, and pulled the backpack on both shoulders with a small grimace, like something in his back hurt when he lifted. At 6:02, as Marla turned the final basement switch and the room dropped to emergency light, the boy moved up the stairs behind her one step at a time, not touching the rail. On the first floor, the old paper smell gave way to wet wool and printer ink and the faint, sugary scent of coffee from the lobby vending machine. He paused under the frozen 3:17 clock and looked at it as if checking whether he was late for something that had already happened. Then he looked toward the glass doors where rain beaded in long, trembling lines and drew the gown tighter at the chests. Marla unlocked one side and held it open. He nodded once, stepped into the evening, and disappeared past the bus stop before she had set the alarm. 2 nights later, Roosevelt High School set out 412 folding chairs on the football field because rain had moved graduation from the bleachers to the gym, then moved it back again when the radar map cleared for one narrow hour between storms. The custodial crew had mopped the hallways at dawn, and by 7:30 a.m., the building smelled like chlorine over old wax and damp cinder block. Parents arrived carrying umbrellas and camera bags and garment covers, shoes sinking slightly in wet grass at the field edge. The principal checked the stage list with a yellow highlighter. The assistant principal, Teresa Quill, 43 and precise down to the minute, stood at the side gate with a clipboard and counted graduates as they came through in gowns that ranged from pressed to wrinkled to borrowed. She had run this sequence for 11 years. She trusted sequence. At 8:07, she heard the first vibration, before she heard a distinct engine, a low pressure inside the chest that seemed to travel through the chain-link fence and up the aluminum bleacher legs. Conversations thinned, then stopped in pockets. Heads turned toward Salem Avenue, where the road bent behind the practice field. The sound came in layers, not one machine, but many, a collective pulse rising and holding, then rising again. Teresa looked at the crossing guard, who looked back with his mouth half open and one hand still raised out of habit, stopping nothing. A child near the concession stand covered his ears. On the gym roof, rain began again in a fine scatter, and each drop clicked against metal while the deeper rumble approached from the street like weather with intention. 600. The first headlights turned the corner in a long, disciplined line, chrome wet from the road, black tires carrying a glaze of grit, riders in dark vests with patches stitched over broad backs and scarred knuckles wrapped around bars polished by years of use. More followed, and more. A steel tide rolling past the visitor lot, then splitting in pairs as if they had rehearsed this exact geometry in another town, another rain, another morning where someone needed a perimeter and not a speech. Parents in folding chairs rose halfway, hands tightening around programs printed on cheap white stock. One man pulled his daughter closer without thinking. A grandmother crossed herself and did not realize she had done it. People recognize leather before they recognize order. People recognize faces weathered by road and sun and old fights, and they filled in the rest with fear faster than facts could arrive. Teresa felt her own first assumption strike hard and ugly. She had spent a career managing crowd flow, liability maps, and exit routes, and every risk training she had ever attended had taught her to identify threat by appearance before behavior had time to prove itself otherwise. The riders cut engines in sequence from front to back, sound falling away in measured steps until only the tick of cooling metal remained in damp air. No one revved, no one shouted, no one moved toward the stage. They waited at idle positions in 2 columns outside the main lane where students would enter, helmets on bars, gloved hands still. The field went quiet enough that Teresa could hear rain tapping the gym roof and the snap of a program page turning in the front row. She looked from the riders to the gate list in her hand, then back again, and for one suspended beat, the whole ceremony seemed to balance on an answer nobody in the school office had ever prepared to give. Teresa lowered her clipboard to her side and kept her face still because one thing administration work taught better than policy binders was that crowds read fear faster than they read facts, and once fear moved through metal bleachers and folding chairs, it took on a life of its own. The lead rider swung a boot down, balanced the bike, and removed his helmet without flourish. Late 40s, maybe 50. Left cheek marked by a pale, jagged scar that pulled slightly when he set his jaw. Sun-bleached hair cut short at the sides. Rain darkening the shoulders of a black vest, already worn soft at the seams. She had seen men like him in discipline meetings and parking lot complaints and school board, public comment nights, always as shorthand for trouble. She had never seen one hold a crowd quiet by doing nothing except standing still. This was the paradox, plain enough to make people uncomfortable. The faces everyone in the front row had already filed under threat were the same faces now holding position with military patience, while Roosevelt's own security team looked to Teresa for instruction they did not yet have. Sometimes the most frightening silhouette in a parking lot was simply the shape of help arriving from outside polite systems. Sometimes the people most practiced at being judged were also the quickest to build order under pressure. The lead rider looked once down the line of bikes, then back to Teresa. No grin, no challenge, no swagger. Just a man waiting for permission to speak on a morning that had run off script. Behind him, engines ticked as they cooled, 1,000 tiny metal clicks moving down the column like distant rain on tin. The riders stayed mounted or stood beside their bikes with their hands in front of them. No one crossed the painted curb line into school property. That detail reached Teresa before any explanation did. Men who intended chaos did not ask curbs where they ended. Officer Danley, the district safety officer in a windbreaker marked security, stepped close enough for Teresa to hear his breath. "You want me to call it in?" he asked. She kept watching the lead rider. "It's already in," she said. She had pressed the emergency line button on her radio without looking, muscle memory, and dispatch had answered with a flat acknowledgement and a unit estimate that sounded like every other estimate she had ever been given during weather delays and parking disputes. 8 minutes, maybe 12. Protocol time, not event time. The rider took one step forward to the gate and stopped exactly at the chain line. "Assistant principal?" he asked. "I am," Teresa said. He nodded toward the football field where families had gone quiet, under umbrellas and ponchos in school colors. "We're here for the ceremony." The sentence landed harder than a threat would have. Teresa glanced at the patchwork of vests again, at old road names stitched in white thread, at gloves tucked into back pockets, at wrists marked with faded ink and scars earned somewhere no handbook covered. "This is a school event," she said. "You can't block access?" "We won't," he replied. He did not add anything after that, and the restraint unsettled her more than volume would have. People used to forcing doors usually filled silence with pressure. He let silence stand. Behind Teresa, the crossing guard finally lowered his arm and wiped rain from his forehead with the back of his hand. Two teachers by the concession stand moved closer together without speaking. In the third row of folding chairs, a woman with a rose corsage pinned to her cardigan folded the printed program twice, then once more, making a hard, narrow strip she could hold like something solid. On the stage, Principal Larkin kept one hand on the podium and watched the gate with the stillness of a man calculating liabilities in real time. The lead writer spoke again, voice even. Nobody revs. Nobody steps over that curb unless she says so. He turned his head just enough for the first two columns to hear him. Eyes out. Hands visible. A wave of nods moved down the line, not dramatic, not loud. Teresa felt Officer Danley shift beside her. They coordinated this, he said, too low for anyone else. Yes, she said. The school had assembled 412 chairs, 186 printed programs, 97 honor cords, 63 staff lanyards, and exactly 0 contingency plans for 600 motorcycles arriving in formation at 8:10 on a Saturday in May. Yet the men beyond the gate had clearly brought one with them and were standing inside it. The dread that had risen first in the crowd did not vanish. It changed shape. It began to look less like panic and more like not understanding the terms of an event that had started before anyone in the main office noticed. Dispatch came over Teresa's radio in clipped syllables. Roosevelt, confirm no active disturbance. Teresa keyed the mic and watched the line of riders while she answered. No active disturbance, she said. Large unauthorized gathering at North Gate. 600 motorcycles, approximate. Subjects compliant, stationary, and awaiting instruction. The word subjects tasted bureaucratic and wrong as soon as she said it, but years in institutions trained language into reflex, and reflex kept reports legible when reality did not. She gave a second description, included weather, number, and position, and received another estimate for responding units that had already slipped by 3 minutes. When she clipped the radio back to her belt, the lead rider was still where he had been, rain collecting on the scar along his cheek and running down to his jawline. What do you want? Teresa asked. He met her eyes and answered like he had rehearsed, saying only this. We want one kid to make it to his name. The line rippled outward through the adults nearest the gate without anyone repeating it aloud. Teresa felt it pass through them in posture. Shoulders dropped by a fraction, heads tilting as people checked their assumptions against that single sentence, and found the math no longer balanced the way it had 30 seconds earlier. She thought of attendance rosters, fee ledgers, counseling notes, temporary housing forms, all the paper channels through which a student could disappear in plain sight, while everyone claimed process had been followed. She thought of the boy Marla Ennis had called about at 6:41 p.m. Thursday, not as a report, but as a worried favor between two women who had worked public buildings long enough to recognize the same child by the same state backpack in different institutions. Keep your line where it is, Teresa said. It stays, he replied. By 8:14, light rain had settled into the fine mist Dayton got in late May, when storm bands broke apart but did not fully leave, and every surface held a different version of wet. The turf gave under dress shoes near midfield and released the smell of cut grass and rubber fill. The concrete walk from gate to gym doors exhaled mineral heat from yesterday's sun, even through the damp. Chrome fenders held beaded droplets so round they looked deliberate, each one reflecting a small, upside-down image of bleachers, umbrellas, and gray sky. From the open gym side doors came the mixed institutional scent of varnished hardwood, old banners, and floor cleaner with a lemon edge that never quite covered the bleach. Teresa moved 3 steps back from the gate and took in the whole approach lane, as if seeing the campus for the first time, rather than the 11th graduation she had scheduled to the minute. Roosevelt High sat on the edge of two Dayton neighborhoods that argued over property lines every budget season and shared the same cracked sidewalks every winter. Red brick from 1968, annex from 1989. Portable classrooms added in 2007 and still called temporary. The north lot lights had one pole out since February. Maintenance tickets still open. The west hallway drinking fountain ran warm 9 months of the year. The PA speaker outside the attendance office buzzed before every announcement, and nobody in facilities could find the grounding fault. Institutions aged in visible compromises. She smelled coffee gone burnt on the hospitality table by the gym entrance and copier toner, drifting from the counseling office where the registrar was still printing corrected name cards because one diploma packet had arrived with 2 misspellings and 1 missing middle initial. Through the open door, she could see stacks of ivory cardstock weighted by a stapler, each card a formal promise that a student had been accounted for at least once. On the far edge of the table sat 8 white envelopes marked "Outstanding Balance" in block letters from the finance office, arranged with painful neatness beside a jar of pens that barely wrote in the damp. Procedure waiting to become embarrassment at check-in. At 8:16, Officer Danley pointed toward Salem Avenue. "City unit," he said. A single cruiser rolled up slow, tires whispering on wet pavement. Lights off, officer inside scanning the line, and then Teresa, and then the line again. He parked 2 lots down and stayed in the car while speaking into his shoulder mic, likely waiting for numbers that would never change fast enough to matter. The riders did not react. Their formation had a practical geometry to it now that Teresa studied it. Enough space between bikes for emergency passage, front wheels angled uniformly toward the road. No blocked hydrants, no crowding of the bus lane painted in fading yellow near the fence. They had set themselves like temporary infrastructure. On the field, families resumed motion in cautious increments. A grandfather adjusted his folding chair and sat. 2 younger siblings in matching rain jackets went back to stepping on puddle edges. A mother near the front row lifted her phone and took one photo of the motorcycle line, then lowered it and looked at the screen for a long moment before slipping the phone into her purse without posting or showing anyone. Perception was changing by degrees too small for speeches. At 8:18, Teresa's radio crackled with Principal Larkin's voice from the stage side. "Status." She answered while keeping eyes on the gate. "No breach. No aggression. They're holding position and following verbal limits." A pause, then, "Can we proceed?" Teresa watched the lead rider, the scar, the rain beating on leather, the still hands. She watched the crowd recalibrating itself around a fact it had not expected. Order sometimes came from people. Institutions taught them to mistrust. "Proceed with lineup," she said. "Delay opening march, 2 minutes." "Copy." She clipped the radio back and finally looked down at her clipboard. Pages stippled with mist. Graduate check-ins had columns for cap, gown, honor cords, pronunciation notes, and fee clearance codes that determined whether a student received a diploma cover at the stage or an envelope with instructions to resolve debt on Monday. In the lower margin, she had handwritten a name after Marla's Thursday call and circled it once. Liam. No last name confirmed. Temporary placement noted. Outstanding gown charge flagged by software after duplicated paperwork. A system error wearing an official seal. The lead writer noticed where her eyes had gone. "He's on your list," he said. "He is," she replied. He nodded once. "Then we wait." The rain sharpened for half a minute, drumming harder on the gym roof and tapping quicker against helmet shells lined on handlebars like black stone bowls. Somewhere inside the building, a bell chimed the quarter hour, too soft to carry far. But Teresa heard it because the crowd had gone attentive again. She walked to the gate, unlatched it halfway, and held it with one hand. The gesture was small, procedural, almost invisible from the stands. It altered the morning anyway. "No one enters without my signal," she said. "No one enters," the rider answered. She left the gate ajar and stepped back into her post, breathing chlorine, wet grass, and cooling metal, while Roosevelt High moved into commencement under a sky the color of old paper and a soundscape of rain, distant traffic, and 600 engines waiting quietly for one name to be called. Jake Hayes stayed where Teresa had left him, one boot on wet asphalt, one hand resting on the left grip of his bike, posture loose enough to look unremarkable, until you saw how little of him was actually at rest. Rain tracked down the seam of his vest and darkened the old eagle stitched over the back panel. Water gathered in the pale groove on his left cheek, the scar pulling when he swallowed. He watched the gate, then the lane to the gym, then the rows of folding chairs, not scanning for threat in the theatrical way men sometimes performed vigilance, but in a flat, practiced loop that had been built long before this morning. By 8:21 on that Saturday in late May, 2 more patrol units had rolled to the far edge of the north lot and stayed there with engines idling, officers inside waiting on instructions that kept changing by radio. That was the outcome of Teresa's call: presence without intervention, caution without comprehension. Jake had expected exactly that. Institutions moved by sequence, and sequence had never been kind to people who lived one bad turn away from losing work, housing, or custody. He had spent enough years in court hallways and county offices to know that the first version of a man like him was always written by someone who had not spoken to him. 49 years of hard living had left their mark, and none of them were decorative. The scar came from Kuwait in 1991, when shrapnel from a vehicle panel glanced him during a night convoy, and the medic stitched him under dim red light with hands that shook from fatigue. The ringing in his right ear came from the same week and never left, a thin electric whine that sat behind every silence and made crowded rooms feel farther away than they were. His spine popped when he dismounted, because an I-beam shifted at a warehouse loading dock in 2008 and pinned him just long enough to change the geometry of his back. He still rode. He still worked when he could get shifts. He had learned the price of slowing down. People in Dayton knew fragments and stitched their own picture from them. They knew he had done 20 months in county lockup after a bar fight outside a pool hall on Keowee Street, where a man went down on wet concrete and did not get up clean. They knew he had not appealed. They knew his marriage to Dana ended in a narrow courtroom with old carpet and a bailiff who called names without looking up. They knew his son, Eric, stopped answering calls at 19 and changed his number before Jake could memorize it. They did not know he mailed birthday cards anyway, one every March, each returned envelope stacked in a drawer by his kitchen sink with the same red stamp, undeliverable as addressed. He kept work through men who valued showing up over resumes. Tires at McClure Auto 2 mornings a week when his back allowed lifting. Overnight freight at a parts distributor off Needmore when they were short 3 hands and desperate enough not to ask about felonies until payday paperwork. He spent Wednesday evenings at a veterans hall where stale coffee sat in dented urns, and men who had learned not to narrate themselves played cards beneath framed photos no one dusted. He was not a joiner by nature. The club came later and stayed because it asked for 2 things he could still give: reliability and restraint. Restraint had not always been his first language. In his 20s, he solved shame with volume and solved fear with his fists, and the world confirmed that choice by meeting him there. In his 30s, he learned that surviving a fight did not mean winning the day that followed it. With rent due and a child waiting at a window and a wife reading silence as indifference because he had no better way to name what war and work and pride had done to him. In his 40s, he learned a narrower, harder discipline. Stand where you are needed, keep your hands open unless they must close, and let action carry what words never could. The club called it watching your lane. He called it staying useful. 3 weeks before graduation, on a Thursday with heat rising off Route 35 in glassy waves, his chain snapped near the overpass by Smithville and locked hard enough to fishtail the rear wheel. He got the bike down without laying it over, coasted to gravel, and crouched with a crescent wrench that had one jaw chipped from years of bad leverage. 112 vehicles passed while he worked and failed. 112. A pastor in a white pickup with a fish decal on the tailgate. A deputy in a marked cruiser who looked once and kept speed. 2 teachers with district parking tags hanging from rearview mirrors. A city bus with 3 empty seats visible through street glass. Every one of them continued east. The boy came from the shoulder carrying a state-issued backpack and moving in a quick, narrow stride that said he had learned to cross spaces where adults were not looking for him. Thin arms under an oversized gray sweatshirt. Shoes with split side seams and white soles gone brown at the edges. Haircut recently, but uneven at the neck, as if someone had done it with care and blunt scissors. He stopped 1 step short of Jake's boots and looked at the chain, not at the man. "Got a master link?" he asked. Jake held up the broken end. "Not one that fits." The boy knelt in gravel, set the backpack down, and unzipped the front pocket where the pull tab had been replaced by a loop of blue thread. From an Altoids tin scratched nearly silver, he tipped out 3 links, 2 tiny clips, and a folded square of emery cloth. His fingers were precise, nails cut short, movements economical in the way of someone who had repaired things because replacement was not available. He worked without chatter. Jake watched those hands and thought of his son at 7, taking apart a bicycle bell on the porch and lining the screws by size on the concrete step so none would be lost. They had finished in 9 minutes. The boy wiped his fingers on his jeans and stood. Jake offered $40. The boy shook his head once. "Keep it for gas," he said, then slung the backpack on and moved toward the bus stop before thanks had fully formed. Jake watched him go and felt the old tinnitus rise in his right ear until traffic sounded like distant surf. He rode home with the new link ticking faintly at first, then settling into clean rhythm. Now, at Roosevelt's North Gate, that same repaired chain sat warm beneath his left leg as cooling rain moved across the lot. The irony did not interest him. The debt did. A gust of damp air carried chlorine from inside the school and the sweet-sour note of wet programs in people's hands. Jake shifted his shoulders, felt the small grind at the base of his spine, and kept his eyes on the check-in lane where students should have been moving by now. He had seen the boy again 2 nights after Route 35, not on a roadside this time, but in a place where men with road grime on their cuffs and club patches on their backs rarely got welcomed unless they were paying fines or apologizing for someone else. It was 5:55 p.m. on that wet Thursday when he pushed open the Dayton Public Library doors with rain dripping from his beard and asked the front desk for the payphone because his cell battery had died, and he needed to call his vice president about a Saturday veterans escort. The woman at the desk pointed toward the hall near periodicals without looking up from a return cart. He stepped across entry tile that smelled of old mop water and printer dust, boots leaving dark marks he wiped once on the mat out of habit. Above circulation, the red digital clock read 317 and stayed there like a stubborn lie. He had not planned to linger. Payphone, call, out. But on the way past the stairwell, he saw a state-issued backpack half hidden behind a basement copy room door. Silver marker number on the front, one zipper missing, blue thread looped where the pull should have been. Recognition moved through him before thought did, sharp and physical as the click of a chambered round from long-ago training lanes. He went down the stairs without asking if he was allowed. The basement air was warmer, close with a copier heat and damp paper, and a fluorescent tube hummed overhead in an uneven buzz that made the silence feel electric. He slowed at the copy room threshold and let his eyes adjust to the dim emergency strips. The boy stood by a wall vent in stocking feet, wrinkled navy gown hanging from one shoulder, cardboard insoles spread on the metal grate like fragile cargo. Rain and chain grease had dried into black lines on his wrists. His chin lifted when he heard Jake's boot scuff tile, but he did not move toward the door. He wasn't crying. He wasn't asking for money, food, or a ride. He looked like a student waiting outside a closed office, posture straight, hands folded around nothing, as if composure could substitute for permission. Jake stopped 2 strides away and kept both hands visible. "Route 35, he said. "Chain day." Recognition flickered once in the boy's face, quick and guarded. Then the boy glanced up toward the ceiling where the closing bell had just rung, and set his jaw with that same practiced stillness Jake had seen at the roadside. When he spoke, his voice came out low and raw from holding too much in for too long. "Please don't let them close the doors before my name is called," he whispered. Jake felt something old and immediate align inside him. The part built in convoy nights and lock-up yards and years of arriving a minute late to places that punished lateness like sin. He did not ask which doors. He did not ask who had failed him this time. He looked at the gown, the drying cardboard, the wrists marked with work no child should have to do, and the state backpack sitting upright as if it had been packed for another transfer already scheduled by someone else's calendar. Decision was not a speech in him. It was a movement. He nodded once. "Get your shoes on," he said. The boy slid the cardboard back into place and tied each lace in careful double knots. Jake stepped into the hallway, reached the payphone by the stairwell, fed in 2 quarters from his vest pocket, and dialed a number he knew by muscle memory. Rain beat the basement windows in steady taps while the line rang. When his vice president answered, Jake gave date, time, dress code, and one instruction about noise discipline, then hung up before questions could start. He went back to the copy room door, stood where the boy could see him, and waited until the library lights cut to night mode, and the building's last public lock clicked into place. The lock clicked, heavy and final, and Marla Ennis stood at the end of the basement hall with her keyring resting against her wrist, looking from Jake to the boy and back again, as if she were measuring where duty ended and something older began. Emergency lights washed the corridor in a low amber that flattened color and made every object look tired. Cinder block walls painted eggshell 15 years ago. A bulletin board with curling flyers for tax help and free flu shots, a dent in the vending machine door where someone had kicked it in February. The boy adjusted his backpack and kept his eyes on the floor tiles, counting seams. Jake had seen that posture in lock-up intake lines and VA waiting rooms, the posture of a person trying to be processed without being noticed. Marla cleared her throat. "I called Teresa Quill after you came in," she said. "Assistant principal at Roosevelt. I told her I found him here in the gown." She held up a folded notepad page where she had written names and times in tight librarian print. I also checked cameras because I needed to know how long he'd been in that room. Jake listened without moving. 43 people passed that copy room door between 4:11 and closing, she said. 43. A substitute teacher printing worksheets, a pastor from New Hope using the fax, 2 city utility workers in reflective vests, a nurse aide in scrub pants, a man from Parks and Rec who comes every Thursday for the local history microfilm, 3 college students from Sinclair, 1 off-duty deputy who asked for the restroom key and walked right past the basement sign. She exhaled through her nose, steady but thin. Every one of them kept going. The boy shifted his weight in damp socks. He did not look up when she said his name. Marla went on, voice lower. At the school, Teresa checked what she could on her end. 11 months, 3 temporary placements, 2 fee waiver packets entered, and then marked missing. 4 reminder letters mailed to an old address after the second placement changed. 1 automated gown charge that kept reappearing every time someone corrected the file. She tapped the paper once with her finger. 9 adults touched that record this spring. Counseling clerk, registrar, 2 front desk secretaries, graduation coordinator, social worker, placement liaison, data specialist, finance office assistant. 9. Not one of them matched the paperwork to the student standing in front of them. Jake felt his jaw set against the old ache in his cheek scar, the fluorescent hum, the chlorine sting from the mop water, the dry rasp of the radiator valve above them. It all sharpened at once. Marla looked at him carefully. He told me you were the man from Route 35. Jake gave one nod. She folded the paper and put it in her cardigan pocket like evidence she did not trust a desk drawer to keep. Teresa asked me one thing before she hung up. She asked whether he had anyone coming Saturday. Marla's eyes went briefly to the boy's backpack, the state-issued stencil number half worn away. I told her what I know. 112 vehicles passed your breakdown on 35 when he fixed your chain, and this city still talks about kids not having initiative. The boy's shoulders drew in by a fraction at the mention of the roadside, as if even praise came with a risk charge attached. Jake knelt so his face was level with him, and kept his hands open on his thighs. You eat yet? Jake asked. The boy shook his head once. Marla stepped around them and pressed $2 in quarters into the vending slot. The machine clunked and dropped a peanut butter cracker pack that smelled faintly stale through the plastic. The boy took it and tucked it into his backpack instead of opening it. Saving it for later was its own answer. They moved up the stairwell together, Marla first with keys, then the boy, then Jake, boots striking concrete, in a measured 3-beat rhythm. On the first floor, the frozen red clock still read 3:17 over an empty circulation desk, and rain traced long diagonal lines down the glass entrance doors. Beyond the doors, the bus shelter glowed under a sodium street lamp, puddles holding reflections of ad posters, and a trash can lid tipped sideways by wind. The building had already crossed from public to closed, but the city outside still moved on schedule. At the mat by the door, the boy sat and pulled on his shoes, pressing each cardboard insole flat with his thumbs before he slid his feet in. He tied one lace, then the other, both in careful double knots. Jake watched those fingers work and thought again of small tools lined in an Altoids tin, of a chain made roadworthy by hands most people never saw. Marla waited with the door half open, alarm panel beeping its countdown from the wall behind her. The boy stood, swallowed, and looked at Jake for the first time since the basement. Please don't let them close the doors before my name is called, he whispered. It was the same sentence, but now it carried the full weight of inventory and omission, every missed form, an unreturned call, an unopened envelope inside it. Jake had heard men ask for morphine in field tents and for mercy in lockup corridors. He had heard his son ask, at 8, if he could stay awake until the bike came back from the shop. None of it landed in him like this. The boy did not ask for a rescue from danger. He asked for access to ordinary dignity. "You'll walk in," Jake said. "You'll hear your name." The boy nodded once, small and exact, and gripped the backpack straps, as if bracing for the next transfer notice anyway. Marla checked the alarm panel and said, "I can't keep the building open." Her voice held apology and bureaucracy in equal measure. "But I can drive you both to the all-night diner on Wayne. Teresa's still at the school with final lists. She said she'll stay late if she has to." Jake looked at the rain, at the bus shelter where water bounced from plexiglass edges in fast silver threads, and shook his head. "He rides with me. You go home." Marla studied him for a beat that felt like an oath being weighed. Then she reached into her tote and handed Jake a business envelope sealed with blue tape. Teresa emailed copies of what she could pull before the district server locked for nightly backup: fee codes, placement notes, name card queue. If anyone says he isn't on the list, you hand them that. She placed the envelope against his vest, hard enough that he had to take it. "Don't lose it." "I won't," he said. She pushed the door wide. Damp air rolled in with the smell of wet concrete and diesel from a passing RTA bus. "Go," she said. "Alarm's at 10. They stepped into the rain. Marla locked the door behind them, checked the handle twice, and stood under the overhang until they reached the curb. Jake guided the boy to the side of his bike farthest from traffic, lifted a spare rain shell from his saddlebag, and settled it over the gown so the navy fabric disappeared under dull black nylon. The boy climbed on behind him without instruction, knees tucked in, hands gripping the rear strap instead of Jake's vest. At 6:14 p.m., under the library awning while rain tapped chrome and gutter metal in 2 different notes, Jake took out his phone, wiped the screen on his sleeve, and dialed a number that did not need his contacts list. 2 rings. 3. The line clicked open. "Rico," a voice said. "Roosevelt High," Jake said. "Saturday, 8:10 a.m. Dress blacks. No noise until I signal." A pause, then, "How many?" Jake watched water run along the curb and carry cigarette filters toward a storm drain clogged with elm seeds. He watched the boy's reflection tremble in a shallow puddle beside his rear tire. "Bring the line," Jake said. Another pause, shorter this time. "Copy." Jake ended the call and put the phone away. He did not explain to the boy what had been set in motion, and the boy did not ask. Marla was still beneath the overhang, one hand on her tote strap, watching them with the expression of someone who had spent 19 years shelving books about civic duty and had just seen where it sometimes lived in practice. Jake kicked the stand up, rolled the bike off the curb cut, and turned toward Wayne Avenue with the envelope inside his vest and the old master link, ticking softly in the chain where the boy had set it. Behind them, the library's exterior lights switched to night mode, one fixture flickering twice before it steadied, and the frozen clock over the circulation desk kept glowing 3:17 in an empty room. Jake eased the throttle and took Wayne Avenue at a steady 30, rain needling his knuckles and sliding off the brim of his helmet in thin, cold threads, while the boy behind him held the rear strap with both hands and kept his knees tucked close to the saddlebags. Traffic lights reflected red and green on wet asphalt, like smeared paint. At each stop, Jake planted his left boot and glanced down to make sure the small black dress shoes behind him stayed on the pegs, the cardboard insoles inside them already darkening again from damp. The envelope Marla had given him pressed against his ribs under the vest, stiff paper warming with body heat, a rectangular reminder that systems loved forms and stamps, even when they forgot children. They reached the all-night diner at 6:29, a low building of fogged windows and a flickering open sign that buzzed like a trapped insect. Inside, coffee and fryer oil overpowered the rain smell, and the vinyl booze held the shine of decades of elbows. Donna Hartwell, 61, owner for 19 years, looked up from the register, took in Jake's vest, the boy's gown under the rain shell, and the hour, then pointed them to the booth nearest the wall outlet, without asking questions she already knew would waste time. Liam slid in and placed his backpack upright beside him. Not on the floor, one hand still hooked through the top loop. He peeled the rain shell off and folded it with care before setting it beside the menu. Donna brought 2 mugs, 1 coffee, 1 hot water with lemon, and set down a plate of grilled cheese cut into triangles, even though no one had ordered yet. "Kitchen closes at 10, but I don't," she said, then walked back to the register and turned the small television down until only weather radar moved silently in the corner. Jake opened Marla's envelope on the table and spread the pages flat with calloused fingers. Fee codes, placement notes, a printout of graduation lineup with Liam's first name, and a blank field where a last name should have been, then a handwritten correction in Teresa's neat block letters. Outstanding balance appeared in 2 separate lines, identical amounts, identical dates, duplicated by software like an echo. No one had bothered to stop. Liam watched the papers without leaning in, face still, jaw set as if waiting for the part where an adult told him to leave the booth and come back Monday. "You're walking tomorrow," Jake said. Liam nodded once. "If they let me through check-in." "They will." Liam looked at the duplicated charge, then at the hot water steaming in front of him. "I can pay some next week," he whispered. "I got 2 shifts at Harlan's garage after school gets out." Jake folded the papers back into 1 stack. "No?" The boy's shoulders tightened a fraction, expecting argument. "No debt table tomorrow," Jake said. "You walk in clean." By 9:12, the rain had thinned to mist, and Donna had called her niece to cover the morning register so she could open early, then returned with a shoebox from the back office. Inside were 3 pairs of black dress shoes, left over from a church clothing drive, sizes written in marker on masking tape. Liam tried the smallest first, too narrow. The second pair fit with room for cardboard, and Donna knelt despite her bad knee and pressed the toe with her thumb to check space, the practical intimacy of someone who had fitted children for winter boots in hard years. She set the old split-seam pair in a plastic bag, tied the handles, and wrote Liam on it with a blue pen. At 10:47, Jake stood under the diner awning and made 6 calls from memory while mist beaded on his phone screen. No speeches, no retelling, time, place, dress code, silence order. He gave each man 1 task: lane markers, check-in table, finance envelope, overflow parking, fuel rotation, and rear perimeter by the practice field. Rico called back at 11:03 only to verify 1 number. "All in?" Rico asked. "All in," Jake said. "Then you'll have full count." Jake ended the call and watched a freight train move across the far crossing, cars clanking one by one through wet darkness. Liam slept in the booth inside with his cheek on folded arms and the new shoes on the seat beside him. He slept like he had trained himself to wake quickly, one hand still touching the backpack loop. By 1:18 a.m., they rode to the club's warehouse garage off Linden, a cinder-block building with 1 security light out and 1 bay door that rattled on its track when wind pushed it. Men arrived in staggered intervals, engines low, boots striking concrete. rainwater pooling under kickstands in crescent shapes. They signed their names on a legal pad clipped to a workbench because Rico insisted on verified count for any organized ride. Then drew gear from plastic bins, black ties, spare gloves, rain covers, reflective tape for lane cones. No one drank. No one argued. Logistics took the room and filled it. Liam sat on an upturned milk crate near a space heater and watched chains being checked, tire pressure gauges clicking, radios paired by channel. A man called Booker laid out 3 extension tables and zip-tied white signs to the front edge. Check-in shoes, check-in cords, check-in balance cleared. Another rider, Mason, counted cashier's checks, twice under the overhead light, amounts matching the printout from Teresa's packet, down to the cent, then slid them into a waterproof document sleeve. Jake took that sleeve and placed it in his vest, beside Marla's envelope. Evidence and remedy in one pocket. At 3:42, they left the garage in groups of 25 to avoid waking neighborhoods with one long pullout. Engines rolled onto surface streets at idle and held there until the highway, where the sound broadened and settled into that familiar low thunder that sat in the chest bone more than in the ear. Liam rode in the chase van with Booker and 3 garment bags of spare gowns, his forehead against cool glass, watching taillights ribbon red through mist. At 7:56, the first group reached Roosevelt's north lot and shut down without cue, metal ticking as rain tapped helmets and chrome. Staff arriving with coffee paused beside their cars, keys still in hand. By 8:02, Teresa Quill stood at the gate in a navy raincoat over her suit, clipboard tucked beneath one arm, radio clipped high on her collar. She looked at Jake, then at Rico, then at the long line still turning in from Salem Avenue, and lifted her chin in a single practical greeting that acknowledged both concern and decision. At 8:07, the second wave crested the bend past the practice field, and the sound reached the football stands before the riders did, a deep layered vibration that entered through aluminum bench legs, fence posts, and wet concrete, then traveled upward into knees, ribs, and sternums, until people fell quiet because the body understood scale before the mind could label it. Conversations thinned to fragments. Program pages stopped fluttering. A toddler in the second row pressed both palms to his father's chest and stared toward the road. The rumble grew and held, not wild, not revved, but disciplined and enormous, as if weather had chosen an engine block and learned formation. Teresa glanced at her watch, then at the gate counter she had borrowed from athletics for attendance click-through. She did not click yet. She waited until the final column cleared the corner and the last rider took position in the north lane. Then she began counting in a voice only Jake and Officer Danley could hear. 594, 595, 596. The final 4 bikes rolled in, headlights pale in the mist, front tires aligning with painted curb marks. 597, 598, 599. The last rider cut to idle and braked at the cone. 600, Teresa said. She looked down at her sheet, wrote the number in block capitals, and added one word beneath it. Exact. Engines cut in sequence, front rank to rear, each shut down a clean mechanical note, until the lot settled into the small, precise sounds that followed motion. Rain on cooling fins, ticking exhaust, a distant flag halyard striking a metal pole, the soft buzz of Teresa's radio waiting to be keyed. Fear had been the crowd's first reflex. Order replaced it in increments they could hear. Jake stepped to Teresa's side of the curb but did not cross. Ready to place the corridor, he said. Teresa keyed her radio first. Command to all staff. Maintain student flow. No deviation from lineup route. North gate access controlled. She unkeyed, looked at Jake, and nodded. Place it. The wall formed with the efficiency of men who had built perimeters in parking lots, funerals, courthouse walks, and hospital exits, always for someone smaller than the threat around them, and always with rules. 2 lines from curb to gym door, 6 feet apart, backs to the crowd, eyes outward. No folded arms, hands visible at belt line, helmets clipped to bars, not carried, patches forward but voices down. They left the center lane wide enough for 2 students abreast and a wheelchair beside them if needed. Booker's team set the check-in tables at the lane mouth under a pop-up canopy, weighted each leg with sandbags, and taped down the corners so wind would not lift them. White signs faced the school doors in clean black letters. Mason handed the waterproof sleeve to Teresa in full view of Officer Danley, who read the top check, then the second, then looked up with a face that had run out of easy categories. Teresa signed a receipt on the back of her clipboard and passed the sleeve to the finance clerk, who stood frozen for half a beat before taking it and moving toward the office at a near trot. External contact resolved, paper trail preserved, debt neutralized before first name call. At 8:19, students began queuing by homeroom. Rain softened to mist again, hanging in the air like breath. Liam stood near the rear of Line C in his wrinkled gown, hair combed damp. New shoes on his feet with cardboard insoles hidden inside. Backpack surrendered to Donna's niece at the volunteer table after a long look and a quiet promise it would be returned. He held his cap with both hands at waist height and stared at the lane between leather sleeves as if measuring whether it was real. Jake took midpoint, exactly where he had said he would. Left cheek scar pale against weathered skin. Vest dark with rain. Spine stiff when he settled his stance, then steady. On Teresa's signal, the first row of graduates stepped forward. The wall did not cheer, did not move, did not claim the moment. It held. When Liam's row reached the mouth of the corridor, he paused once, only once, and looked toward Jake. Jake gave a short nod, no smile. Just instruction, made gentle. Walk, he said. Liam walked. The corridor held around him like a measured current. 600 men standing with their backs to the crowd, rain darkening leather seams, engines cooling in patient ticks behind them, and the only sound in the center lane, the soft scuff of graduation shoes and borrowed dress hems brushing wet concrete. He kept his cap at his waist and his eyes forward, but at the midpoint he looked once to the left, where Jake stood, with his shoulders square and his scar pale against rain-browned skin. Jake did not reach out. He only stayed exactly where he had promised to be. By 8:31, the line had moved from the lot to the gym doors in a steady file, and the check-in table had done what the school office had not done all spring. Booker's signs stayed taped flat despite the damp wind. Check-in shoes, check-in cords, check-in balance cleared. The finance clerk, Carla Nunes, had returned from the office with her blazer sleeves rolled and a ledger printout stapled to Teresa's receipt. 8 envelopes had been zeroed against the cashier's checks, including Liam's duplicated gown charge, both entries marked paid and one marked system duplicate, removed in block letters so no one could reanimate it next week by mistake. She handed Teresa a carbon copy and said, "I initialed each line," then went back to the table and cleared 2 more students whose families had arrived with apology money folded in church envelopes they no longer had to open. Inside the gym, varnished floor and damp cloth made a warm, close smell that sat low in the lungs. The band's recorded processional came through 2 old speakers with a faint hum under the treble. Folding chairs for graduates clicked and scraped in small waves as rows sat and stood on cue. Liam took his assigned seat in row C between a girl from his homeroom, who kept smoothing her honor cord, and a boy in borrowed cuffs that sat too short at the wrist. He placed his cap on his knee and flattened the tassel once with his thumb. Not fidgeting, orienting. Teresa stood at the stage right with the corrected card stack, reading each line before passing it to Principal Larkin. At 8:44, she paused at Liam's card, where the morning's printed blank had been overwritten in her hand, with the only surname available in confirmed documents. Hayes. She held the card for a beat, then looked up at Larkin. He met her eyes and gave one short nod that carried its own apology, for every morning he had trusted software to be neutral. Names moved across the microphone in careful sequence. Applause rose and fell in family-shaped bursts. When Teresa passed Liam's card, Larkin read from it without flair, voice even, and clear into the gym rafters. Liam Hayes. The sound that followed was not one cheer. It was a layered release that began in the folding chairs, lifted from the doorway, and crossed the threshold into rain where the riders stood. Families clapped. Staff clapped. A grandmother in a rose cardigan stood and pressed both palms together under her chin before she remembered to clap too. At the north doors, Officer Danley looked out at the two fixed lines of motorcycles and removed his cap for the span of Liam's walk to the stage. Liam crossed polished floor in black shoes that were not split at the seams, cardboard still hidden inside to keep the fit true. He took the diploma cover with both hands, looked at it once as if checking it was not another routing slip, and turned toward the photo mark taped to the floor. The district photographer lifted her camera, then lowered it again and took a second frame from wider back, including the open doors and one dark line of riders beyond. She would later say she did it for composition. In truth, she had understood scale. When the final name was called and caps stayed on because the gym roof still leaked in two places and staff did not want mortar boards in standing water, the graduates were directed back out through the same lane. Rain had narrowed to mist, fine enough to hang in the air and bead along eyebrows without falling. Liam came out with his row, diploma cover under one arm, cap in his left hand, and the state-issued backpack now hanging from his right shoulder, where Donna's niece had returned it exactly as promised. The plastic bag with his old shoes, Liam in blue pen across the handles, was tucked inside the outer pocket. Jake stayed at midpoint until the last student cleared the lane. Then he stepped one pace inward and stopped. Liam stopped too. For a second, neither spoke. The lot carried small sounds. Flag halyard tapping metal, a far siren on Salem, rain ticking from helmet rims. Liam set the diploma cover on top of his backpack, opened the front pocket, and brought out the Altoids tin. The silver surface was scuffed nearly blank from years of handling. He flipped the lid with his thumbnail, tipped one tiny piece into his palm, and held it out. It was the old Master Link from Route 35, cleaned with emery cloth until the steel showed bright at one edge and dark at the other. Jake looked at the child's hand first, then at the link. His own hand came up, scarred knuckles broad and rough against the small, narrow palm. Liam placed the metal piece in the center of Jake's hand and closed Jake's fingers around it one by one, as if securing a fastener that mattered. "For your chain," Liam whispered. Jake swallowed once. "It's been holding," he said. Liam nodded. "Keep this one anyway." Jake did not try to answer with anything larger than that moment could carry. He tucked the master link into his inner pocket and pressed the snap shut. Then, with permission asked only in his posture, he set his hand lightly on the back of Liam's shoulder and guided him the last 20 feet to where Teresa waited near the gate table with a folder under her arm. Teresa handed Liam a sealed school envelope and spoke to him first, not around him. Final transcript request form, replacement ID voucher, and a copy of today's clearance ledger, she said. You don't owe Roosevelt $1. Liam took the envelope in both hands. Teresa turned to Jake and offered back Marla's packet, now clipped with district forms and a signed incident sheet from security. Everything in your envelope is copied and filed. Nothing gets relabeled on Monday. Officer Danley stepped in beside her, holding a rain-specked notepad. Dispatch closure number is 24-5187, he said. Report reads, no disturbance, voluntary crowd support, ceremony completed. He looked at Jake, then at the line of riders beginning to break formation by twos on Rico's silent hand signal. I've written worse reports on quieter mornings. Near the curb, Principal Larkin crossed the lane with his tie loosened and his dress shoes wet to the welt. He stopped in front of Jake and, after a visible hesitation that acknowledged years of assumption, held out his hand. Jake took it. Larkin said, we should have caught this before today. It was not polished language. It was enough. At 9:26, city units cleared one by one, tires whispering over wet paint as they left the north lot. External contact closed. No citations, no dispersal order, no escalation to explain. Rico began lifting cones. Booker folded the pop-up canopy and stacked table legs in the chase van. Mason collected the remaining document sleeve, now empty except for Teresa's signed receipt, and clipped it into the warehouse binder so the money trail stayed visible if anyone asked later. Physical evidence accounted for, down to signatures and timestamps. Liam stood near Jake's bike while Donna arrived with a paper sack of wrapped sandwiches and 2 apples from the diner, pressing them into his backpack side pocket without ceremony. For later, she said. Marla pulled up 10 minutes after that in her library cardigan and stepped out holding the same key ring she had carried at closing 2 nights earlier. She looked at Liam's envelope, at the diploma cover, at the 2 lines of motorcycles, now opening into ordinary traffic, and the tightness around her mouth eased for the first time all morning. I fixed the basement work order again, she said to Liam, and the clock request. 4th time. Liam looked at her, then at Jake, uncertain whether that detail mattered. It does, Jake said. By 10:12, the lot had thinned to scattered families and janitorial carts. Rain stopped. Sun came through in a pale strip along the gym wall, lighting water droplets on chrome like pinpoints. Jake fastened his helmet, then paused as Liam reached into the plastic bag and pulled out his old split-seam shoes. He set them side by side on the curb, toes pointed toward the road, laces tied in the same careful double knots as always. Not discarded. Placed. Marla saw it and pressed her fingertips briefly to her lips. Teresa saw it and wrote one final note on her clipboard before closing it for good. Neither woman looked away. Sometimes reputation is just a costume people pin to strangers because it saves them the work of seeing clearly. Character is what gets built, counted, signed, and held in place when a child says one quiet sentence and the system has no answer ready. Jake swung onto the bike, waited until Liam climbed on behind him, and guided the front wheel past the curb where the old shoes sat drying in a thin bar of sunlight, while 600 riders peeled out in disciplined pairs, and the road ahead sounded less like thunder now and more like breath.